Well, hello. I'm intending this lesson for my management accounting honors students, but if you've dialed into this session because you are looking to pass CIMA examinations, the E3 exams, so much the better. All right, I'm going to share a presentation with you because I'm going to be talking to you about change management and change leadership. Hang on a second and I'll retreat to the corner of the screen. Right. So the point here is, and this has been sanctioned by Scholar Dog. And if Millie's happy, then I'm happy. There's an agenda here, and what we're looking to do is achieve this. There's a series of logical statements here, and I don't think that anything I have put down in this slide deck is contradictory. So you should be able to buy into the fact that business performance is about interrogating how a business handles itself with respect to what we've referred to as the determinants of financial results. And with that being in place, we can say that if a business is not working ideally or optimally, then we have to fix the broken bits. Now, the point, however, is what the broken bits actually are, because typically that's not straightforward, because we're looking here to change people more than anything else and the way people do things. So I'm going to make a contentious statement. Those determinants inside a business are social, political, economical, and let me make a contentious statement. The determinants are social, technical, political, economic, and you're going to say, hang on a second, that is the external environment, not the internal one. And I'm going to point out to you that it is a construct that we can apply to a business, and it shouldn't be confusing simply because we're referring here to the nature of an enterprise as being a mixture, an amalgam of people and power relationships and money and the lack thereof. And the way the enterprise harnesses technology in order to execute on its value proposition. Because more than anything else, if we are changing the determinants in a business, then we're really doing nothing other than getting out of a rut. So with this in mind, I have clipped this from a presentation that I've pinned to my Moodle page. If we are trying to get out of a rut, then we're going to have to improve the way we do things. We improve our change capability, and that's not easy, not straightforward, and that's because the environment that enterprises operate within are VUCA, and you know what that's about, and if that's the case, you're going to say we need someone absolutely superhuman to do something about that, and perhaps that is the case. But we just get to refer to it in plain simple English as change leadership. And I quote for you over here, Cotter and Schlesinger from 1979, who say that, or point out to us that when asked to provide opinion on this, the commentary goes that, and what will you be saying? We 40 years on. In a few years, we're going to be half a century on. Nothing has changed, and nothing has changed in many centuries. If we are changing things, then, and I'm going to have to edit this out as well. What is the point here? What they're saying is the theme throughout their reports is that the key factor in change is the ability of an organization to respond to what is happening out in that pest environment, the external pest this time. It follows that an acceleration in the rate of change will result in an increasing need for reorganization. Reorganization is usually feared, though, because it means disturbance of the status quo, a threat to people's vested interests in their jobs, and an upset to established ways of doing things. For these reasons, needed reorganization is often deferred, with the resulting loss in effectiveness and an increase in costs. what we're studying here and what CIMA placed before you, as we presenting this at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, is that you have to get on top of change, and that means that managers need to be on top of change. And hopefully for anyone watching this particular e-lesson, that means that one day you're going to be one of those people who's spearheading a necessary change initiative or intervention. So this is about making sure that you have the necessary constructs and precepts to be able to address change at some point in time in the future. But recognize, I think, that we're talking about change in your life as well. Now, there's a point over here, and that is that there are several paradigms which complexion our view of this particular issue. And as a brief sidebar, I'm going to say, if you're unfamiliar with the word, that a paradigm is simply the way we look at things. It's a lens, all right? A way of viewing reality, as I've documented for you there. Now, here's a paradigmatic lens that says that we address certainty and contingency in different ways, or we view them in different ways. And you've done this because you've done a BCom degree, and your BCom degree tells you that there was a time in the last century, the beginning of it, when Henry Ford was working out how to make lots of cars more cost effectively than anyone else, in an industrial boom at the beginning of the 1900s, that you, whether you were listening to Ford or whether you were listening to Fail, you would, as I put it colloquially, smite the workers. People were machines. We made them do work. Henry Ford was not reputed necessarily to be an unpleasant boss, but he wanted the job done. And that means we broke the job down into component parts, and that was dehumanizing in so many respects. The trend was to move to the human relations approach, which I say is be nice but smite when it's right. So scientific management is about certainty and powerful control over people, because the issue is getting the processes right. People are somewhat secondary to the importance of the process. Go back to Fail 1914 if you don't believe me. And the human relations approach, which I think was Mary Parker Follett in the early 1930s, in a world which had been torn apart by the First World War and a major depression following the decade thereafter. People are people, thinking, feeling, anticipating, fearing, and it is people, not processes, that make the difference. Now, that being the case, we have to say, as another one of my asides, is everyone a switched-on person who makes a contribution and should therefore be valued for their contribution? Because I'm not for a minute regarding people as expendable, and I'm not saying that people should not be regarded for being people. But I am saying, because it is the case, that not every human being working in commerce and industry is a value add to the organization, because sometimes organizations get it wrong and they employ the wrong people. They put square pegs in round holes, and sometimes organizations get it wrong because they don't really understand what they want and they can't really assess people. I'm not saying people are to blame. Now, if we are looking at this view, if we're looking through this paradigmatic lens, then we're saying that it's important to recognize that leadership and communication are the vital things here, and that there needs to be intrinsic motivation. And you recognize now that my views on people are not avant-garde by any stretch of the imagination, and that organizational structures, as I've typed for you, need to facilitate flexibility and involvement. Where they don't, you might want to contemplate that things need to change. See what I did there? So there are two central propositions here. We're looking at the complexity of the social system, and we are looking at the fact that people have emotional needs, and not just the need to be fed and watered like horses. They need to feel content, and that is the defining characteristic of our species at this point in time, is it not? That we are capable of reflecting on our circumstance. The point I wish to make here is that the human relations approach morphed, if you like, post-Second World War, and a number of other conflicts, because the world seems to be in perpetual conflict. The contingency theory welded or melded these two views together. A rejection of one best way, noting that there might be multiple best ways, but it's based upon the organization that you are looking at. And with that in mind, I'm going to say that we recognize that if we are to manage in a contingency context, then we look at three primary things, and I'm going to give you three examples over here, and they're just news articles that I've picked up in the last week, which is the first week of October 2023. The global mining industry is having to change, and this was prompted by news of the fact that we had one of South Africa's oldest mining houses leave South Africa's shores in order to lodge a primary listing elsewhere, because its primary interests are elsewhere. And that's because South Africa, which is a great place to mine coal, much like China, for example, is a great place to mine coal, is not what investors want to back, because it's bad for your reputation. Another example of environment is this notion of the tobacco industry, where Rishi Sunak, and who has attracted the wrath, perhaps, of his party, in other news, has said that we need in the United Kingdom to limit the capacity of children to ever begin the habit of smoking. So I don't have an example for you with regard to size, but I do have one final one here, and that is a view on technology, which suggests, and I'll let you read this for yourselves, that suggests that technology is going to change the way we generate energy. And we've moved from oil lamps to a massive exploitation of fossil fuels. And there is move afoot to alter that. And while there are some who would decry it as effective, it is the case that there is at least a handful of nations who have switched their dependence on energy from fossil fuels. So the views of Bernard Burns, I think, are valuable here, and it's something that's worthwhile looking up, because he, I think, puts it particularly well. This notion of there being no one best solution or best fit for all organizations is something which he provides very usefully in this 2x2 matrix. And he points out that where you have environments and contexts which are stable, then you can expect that mechanistic structures will work well in those contexts. But on the other hand, he points out that where you have small organizations, then the best thing to do is to evolve on an organic basis. We're talking here about evolutionary strategy as opposed to deliberate strategy. Something to think about, just another point of view, if you like. So, yet another point of view was introduced sometime back in the 1970s, and it emanated in the United States of America, where post the Second World War, and ignoring for the time being the conflicts that the Americans were involved in post-Second World War, we're saying that the emphasis on productivity and efficiency became absolutely key, particularly so as we entered into the 1960s, and the Americans found themselves competing with the Japanese, who had recovered from the Second World War conflict to some extent and were proving themselves as mighty severe competitors. So with that in mind, Johnson and Uchi wrote in 1974 that Japanese workers were just more efficient and effective, therefore, than American workers. And this is what Sheldrake had to say in 1996. For an American audience, this was a shocking statement, confirming the worst fears of a decline in the United States of America's competitive edge over the rest of the world. Since the Second World War, American manufacturers had grown accustomed to outproducing and outperforming every foreign competitor. The era of the Cold War had led Americans to believe that the only danger to their general security sprang from communism and specifically the Soviet Union. The notion that their comprehensively vanquished enemies and strategic clients, the Japanese, might be poised to overhaul them technically and even economically was unpalatable, even unbelievable. Now, you had Tom Peters and Robert Waterman come onto the scene in 1982. It was my introduction in the 1980s to the In Search of Excellence series, but you also had Moskanter and Handy commenting on what it would take for a company to, or an enterprise to, demonstrate itself as a really great performer. That culture excellence paradigm thing is summed up by Rogers here. Culture is at the heart of competitive advantage, particularly when it comes to sustaining high performance. Bain & Company research found that nearly 70% of business leaders agree that culture provides the greatest source of competitive advantage. In fact, more than 80% believe an organization that lacks a high-performance culture is doomed to mediocrity. And if you want to look it up, because it's a very useful thing, we had Drucker saying that culture eats strategy for lunch. So there is this notion that if you're going to change an organization to be a really competitive one, then there needs to be 8 key attributes. And those key 8 attributes are a bias for action and orientation, being on the front foot, muted aggression, if you like, closest to the customer, autonomy and entrepreneurship, productivity through people, hands-on, value-driven, stick to the knitting, simple form, lean staff, and simultaneous loose, tight properties. This is where it starts to get a little hairy. And I do have a copy of Tom Peters' book written in the 1990s, perhaps in the early 2000s, I really can't remember, which addresses the way organizations should be. And I'm looking at my shelves and I don't unfortunately see it. Otherwise I'd hook it off and show you the cover. But what he wrote was a book which was not your standard kind of book that said, this is Peters describing and explaining and confiding and drawing you in. It was a book which gave you lots of pictures and lots of examples and lots of exhortations, which were written in an unusual manner. I don't know that it would have been a bestseller, but he would have sold a lot of them because it was Tom Peters after all, and the man is a bit of a guru. Not so? So Rosebeth Moskanter says, and I like this, if the new game of business, and remember she was writing this back in 1989, if the new game of business is indeed like Alice in Wonderland croquet, then winning it requires faster action, more creative maneuvering, more flexibility, and closer partnerships with employees and customers than was typical in the traditional corporate bureaucracy. Let me take you back to scientific management meets human relations approach meets the contingency approach. All right, that's what Moskanter is talking about here. It requires more agile, limber management that pursues opportunity without being bogged down by cumbersome structures. Peters was saying much the same thing, or weighty procedures that impede action. Corporate giants, in short, must learn how to dance. I like it. Now, something that I don't talk about when I teach the evolution of management theory is the great man theories that kind of fell out of favor when we got to fail writing about revolution in industry in the early 1900s. The great man theories effectively summed up this notion that there were people, I expect, with great big handlebar moustaches that were just in charge of things because they were so good. I don't know that that is necessarily a valid view, and I'd like to present you with an alternative. And I think the alternative is this one here: that you do need great leaders, transformative leaders, if you like. But this is not a lecture in leadership. This is a lesson in change management and change leadership, which is a little different. It's kind of the same, but kind of different. If an organization, instead of being led by one heroic leader, has a broad-based leadership team that will be better prepared and able to deal successfully with a much wider range of challenges, which means we need, I think, to talk about what I mean by heroic leader, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the deal is that recognizing what the issues are, because now we're talking people and power relationships, culture, in other words, remember, recognizing where the problems are is not straightforward, because people are not science, people are art. And Duncan wrote back in 1975 that there are 3 levels of management / leadership, maybe, activity: philosophical, which is about setting the goals for the enterprise, and I think the general understanding of what business is and how it should take place and what people are; and scientific, which is what we understand as goal accomplishment and evaluation; and art. And if this is how you understand art, you might be saying, I don't get it. Let me go a little further, because it can be clearer than this, and I'll make it clearer for you. So if we're distinguishing heroic management from engaging management, then the deal is that heroic managers are just special people, whereas engaging management, and I'm not saying transformative management, I'm saying engaging management, is about valuing the people around you. Heroic managers are, in traditional hierarchy, more important. Size of the car allowance, or the size of the company car, just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you're sitting in the back seat of something which is driven by a chauffeur. Whereas engaging management says that we're not getting stuck in the notion of vertical hierarchy. What we want to focus on is that a business is an interactive network. The heroic manager school of thought responds and says that, well, it's the guy at the top, the guy in the corner office, or the woman in the corner office, as the case might be, who decides what's going to happen. The alternative is to say, well, there's someone who coordinates this process and who might make the final decisions, because they are, in the final analysis, the person who is ultimately accountable. But the case is that people fix things, and as they fix things, it becomes clearer. It's not one great big grand deliberate strategy, which is where our classical strategic thought comes from, that fixes things. Battles are won in a series of small conflicts and engagements. So heroic managers will present you with the notion that if people resist change, then what you do is you get a consultant in. Maybe that's not something I buy into. Whereas the alternative is to contemplate that implementation and formulation are in fact one and the same thing, really, because a healthy change requires respect for the old alongside recognition of the new. And sometimes autocratic environments find it very, very difficult to make this happen. So heroic managers make decisions and allocate resources because they are the decision makers. I mean, that's what we learn in the principles of management, not so. The alternative is to say that a manager is in fact a leader, bringing out the best in people, about engaging people with the process, hence engaging management, as it says here in the label, and inspiring people, which is where we get our notions of transformative management. And Finally, the big pay packet should go to the person who has achieved all of these mighty things. Whereas the alternative school of thought says that everyone should share. But the school of thought also says that the rewards are not primarily financial, they are psychological. And this is in industrial psychology what we would look at as engaged personnel. Not so. So if we go back to this notion of management being philosophy and science and art, then I think it can be assessed in this way. And in my assessment, because I take responsibility for this, what you see here is there's no art in heroic management, but there is a great deal of art in engaging management. So my point to you is that for my MAFM 714 students, we, with this D2 theme, conclude or lesson rather, conclude the theme, and it requires you to have a comprehension of performance management, strategic performance management specifically, which is not just about the balanced scorecard, but that's a useful way to get into the D1 lesson and material, but also the precepts underpinning change management and the strategic leadership of change efforts. I'm going to give you a test on this, and then we can move on to the digital strategy theme, theme E, before you conclude this module. So I hope this sums it up for you. My recommendation is you get to grips with what I've presented you over here, and then you can sink yourself into a Kaplan text or any other text which CIMA has made available as a recommended resource. Thanks for your time.